Hi, my name is Tommy Cline, and I, with Amanda Korte, will review for you Terry's Chapter 4, Ethics in Clinical Research. There are some ethical principles that need to be considered when conducting your research. Autonomy. One of the main ethical principles that should be ingrained in all researchers is autonomy and the responsibilities it brings the researcher. Autonomy is the ethical principle related to informed consent. This provides a person with the right to make an informed decision about whether to participate in a research study. Beneficence, in comparison, is the ethical principle that guides healthcare providers to act in the best interest of the research participant. Justice, finally, is the principle governs recruitment of research subjects. This principle affects recruitment of research subjects. It mandates that research participants are selected from multiple groups rather than only from a pool of those most likely to be coerced, such as subjects with severe physical or mental illness or those who are economically disadvantaged. Confidentiality. It's important for the DNP researcher to recognize that informed consent is not synonymous with confidentiality. Although privacy can be considered a person's ability to control the access of other people to information about him or herself, confidentiality refers to protection of such information so that researchers will not disclose records that identify individuals. Regardless of the sensitivity of the information gathered during the course of the study, the ethical investigator will guarantee the confidentiality of the data collected from human subjects. Informed consent. Although autonomy, beneficence, and justice are the ethical principles that should govern the conduct of the DNP student who is engaged in research that involves human subjects, informed consent ensures these principles are observed when this type of research is implemented. Informed consent ultimately implies that the potential participants' ratio of risk to benefit is clearly identified and understood. There are some rights of participants in a research study. These include the right to be informed of both the nature and purpose of the research, the right to receive an explanation of the procedures to be performed, to receive a description of risks or any discomfort that may occur, to receive an explanation of expected benefits of the research, the right to receive a disclosure, the right to receive information on other forms of treatment, the right to ask questions, the right to be told that consent to participate may be withdrawn at any time, the right to receive a copy of any signed and dated written consent issued during the study, and the right to decide to consent to participate or not without any type of force, fraud, deceit, duress, coercion, or other influence being applied. Health insurance portability, otherwise known as HIPAA. When we talk about HIPAA, we'll look at the privacy rule. The privacy rule is implemented as the first phase of HIPAA in 2004, and it defines patient rights regarding individual health information and established protection for access to and release of a patient's medical record. The common rule for HIPAA also mandates that creation of privacy boards whose sole authority it is to review individual privacy rights. The common rule is similar to the privacy rule, although it applies only to federally funded research. Protected health information, or PHI. If the researcher uses PHI in research, legislation considers this type of information to fall in one of three categories. No consent form is required, but the researcher must sign a restricted user agreement, or no consent form is required, but review by an institutional review board, or IRB, or privacy board is required. Or lastly, individual authorization is necessary. Data that cannot be released without prior authorization. The researcher should further recognize that specific data elements cannot be released during the course of the research project without prior auth from the subject in question. Some of these include the name of the research participant, geographic areas smaller than a state, except for the first 3 digits of the zip code, dates of birth, dates of death, dates of admission, or ages greater than 89 years, driver's license or automobile license numbers, VIN numbers, social security numbers, medical record numbers, health plan numbers, account numbers, telephone or fax, email addresses, internet URLs or IP addresses, professional license numbers, or even medical device or serial numbers.
Institutional review boards, known as IRBs. The purpose of the Institutional Review Board is to oversee informed consent. This is to make sure that our vulnerable populations especially remain protected in our research. This is a federal policy which was published in 1991. So why is an IRB done? Well, like I said, an IRB is done to make sure that the population who is being researched is protected, especially our vulnerable populations. There are several people who need to get an IRB, although a lot of institutions and private researchers who are getting research or doing the research prefer to have an IRB done just to avoid liability. Every institution receiving federal funding needs to do an IRB. Most institutions that are getting private funding, most biomedical journals require an IRB. A lot of universities you'll see get IRBs, although these are not required for them. However, like I said, most use them to avoid liability. Criteria. So when an institution submits an IRB, they must follow certain criteria to be able to be approved for research. They must have minimal identified risks to human subjects, equitable selection of human subjects, appropriate documentation of informed consent from all participants, appropriate monitoring of data to ensure safety of subjects, and ensuring privacy and confidentiality of informed information and data collected. IRB evaluation. Because the purpose, or one of the purposes of the IRB, is to be able to protect participants and those being researched on, the consent form will be scrutinized by the IRB board. So they will look at any obvious or hidden costs to the subjects, presentation of the purpose of the research, benefits and risks to the participants, protection of confidentiality. The contact person should be on the consent form so that the person involved in the research may have a point of contact even after the research is completed, and how the results generated by the study will be used. The participants should not have any special benefit, meaning they shouldn't be students that have been given extra points in class, or there should be no indication that they'll receive any special benefit. Explanation of the study should be done by a third party rather than by the researcher themselves. Expedited reviews. Expedited reviews should always be the goal of the DNP researchers for a couple reasons. The biggest reason being we want to cause minimal harm for our patients, and also there's a bit of a time constraint in the DNP programs. Only one member of the IRB board will need to review the project proposal if it's an expedited review. If it's a typical review, 5 members of the IRB board will be reviewing the project proposal. In order to be eligible for an expedited review, you must fall under the following categories: collecting hair and nails that do not cause disfiguration, collecting secretions or perspirations, recording information on subjects 18 years and older using non-invasive procedures considered to be routine, collecting voice recordings, studying data, documents, records, pathological specimens, or diagnostic data which is already in existence. There is an opportunity to be exempt for review. Although the review should still be sent to the IRB board, the board may choose to exempt you. This is in situations like educational settings, such as universities. As discussed earlier, a lot of universities and educational settings prefer to submit all information and to obtain an IRB to avoid any liability. Surveys which enable identification of the patient may be exempted from review. Collecting existing data of de-identified or publicly available resources. Federal agencies conducting research for the good of the general public. And then any research related to taste and food quality. The application process may be quite tedious. Initially, the applicant needs to submit a brief statement of hypothesis, research question, objectives, and purpose. After that's submitted, the IRB will begin the review process. So then they will request information from the subjects participating and from the researchers, especially the vulnerable population. The researcher should be prepared to submit all details of the research, including but not limited to confidentiality, any instruments used, any surveys used, including questions on the surveys, informed consent form, description of what will be done to the subjects, and anything else applicable to the research. It's also suggested that the researcher has an alternate plan if the IRB process is not approved. Review criteria. The goal is to minimize risk. If the risk is not seen as minimal to the subjects, the IRB board may refuse to approve the IRB. If this is the case, the researcher must be prepared to answer the following questions. Do the protocol's eligibility criteria adequately minimize the identified risk to subjects? Do the protocol's eligibility criteria adequately monitor the identified risk to the subjects? Are the proposed procedures justified, reasonable, and comfortable as possible for the participants? Are the research personnel both qualified and adequately trained to implement the study procedures? And are the identified risks to subjects reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits? If the IRB is not approved, the researcher must come up with a data and safety monitoring plan. So this is only done if the protocol identifies more than minimal risk to human subjects. Having a thorough data and safety monitoring plan will allow the investigator to monitor the data, so the IRB board will request information on how the investigator monitors the data, how the researcher will respond quickly to any adverse events or unanticipated problems. You must be prepared for confidentiality to be questioned as well. So will the location of the data gathered allow for privacy? How will the data be stored? And how will the data be recorded? Thankfully, there is a formula for success. It's suggested that you use simplified language, you provide rationale, choice of design, and degree of potential risk, discuss protection of subjects throughout the project, provide detailed information in all areas of recommended documentation, and achieve consistency across all documents. Remember, with our consent forms, they should be geared towards the 5th to 8th grade learning level. And that concludes Chapter 4 of Allison J. Terry, Clinical Research for the Doctor of Nursing Practice.